Godt. Jamen kom op og stå, fordi vi skal starte med at hoppe og danse. We're going to start to jump and dance in the morning for Jesus.
Det er så cool, det er virkelig sejt. Det bobler op, og det bobler ud, og der bliver et glædeshyl. Jeg er så glad, at Jesus kender mig, og han har sagt, at han aldrig forlader mig. Han er min konge, og han er min ven. Kom med og søg. For vi er kongens børn. Han er med os hver eneste dag. Oh, 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 oh. Vi hopper, vi danser, og vi er så glade. Vi visker, vi råber, Jesus, vi elsker dig. Oh, 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 oh. Jeg har noget at fortælle dig. Det er så cool, det er virkelig sejt. Det bobler op, og det bobler ud, og der bliver et glædesyn. Jeg er så glad, at Jesus kender mig, og han har sagt, at han aldrig forlader mig. Han er min konge, og han er min ven. Så kom med og syng. Han er med os hver eneste dag. Oh, oh, oh. Vi hopper, vi danser, og vi er så glade. Vi visker, vi råber, Jesus, vi elsker dig. Vi hopper, vi danser, og vi er så glade. Vi visker, vi råber, Jesus, vi elsker dig. Vi danser, vi visker, vi råber, vi hopper, vi danser, vi visker, vi råber. Vi hopper, vi danser, ja, vi er så glade. Vi visker, vi råber, Jesus, vi elsker dig. Vi hopper, vi danser, og vi er så glade. Vi visker, vi råber, Jesus, vi elsker dig. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh,
Vi skal synge en sang, som er på flere forskellige sprog. Now we're going to sing a song in several different languages. So we're going to start with Danish. Vi starter med dansk, then we're gonna do Norwegian, så tager vi på norsk. Then we're gonna do Swedish, and then we're gonna try to do Finnish. Bear with us. And then we're gonna end with English. Så dansk, norsk, svensk, finsk, engelsk. Og der er ikke særlig mange ord. Det er et kor, vi gentager. One chorus that we're going to repeat. So, let's do this, okay? Sing, sing, sing. Sing, sing, sing.
Okej, en gång till. Sing, sing, sing. Orkestern sammen himlen bliver. Sing, sing, sing. Taknemmelig at du hører når vi priser dig. Ophøjer navnet Jesus.
Gör musik ihop med himlen. Kom och sjung, sjung, sjung. Tack för att du höres när vi prisar dig. Upphöjer namnet Jesus. Sjung, sjung, sjung. Gör musik ihop med himlen. Kom och sjung, sjung, sjung. Tack för att du höres när vi prisar dig. Upphöjer namnet Jesus.
Alright, let's try and finish. Laulama, sole ylle dyste Jesus nyt mig. Laulama, kiitos et kulle kun mä laulama. Ja belver med sua Jesus. Is that correct? Once more. Laulama, sylle ylle tysta Jesus nyt mä laulama. Kiitos että kulle kun mä laulama. Ja belver med sua Jesus.
Let's do it in English. Sing, 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 and make music with the heavens. We will sing, sing, sing. Grateful that you hear us when we shout your praise. Lift high the name of Jesus. One last time, we're gonna do it English. Sing, 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 and make music with the heavens. We will sing, sing, sing. Grateful that you hear us when we shout your praise. Lift high the name of Jesus.
Yes, we're so glad we finally have a finished song. Let's go to Christian.
Vi är barn och vi är här. Hör på oss, ja, lyssna och lär. Jesus han tycker att barn är bra. Bli som dem, var ju det han sa. Vi är barn och vi är här.
Every star and galaxy will sing his praise. Everything that you have made, by the power of your name, will unite one glorious day to sing your praise. God of glory, glory, we want to see your glow shining brighter, brighter. We long to see your name be lifted higher, higher. We will sing your praise forevermore, forevermore. This world and every story we have heard can compare with all your words. We'll sing your praise. All the nations will bow down, every king will cast his crown. There's no equal to be found. Now sing his praise. God of glory, glory, we want to see your glow shining brighter, brighter. We long to see your name be lifted higher, higher. We will sing your praise forevermore, forevermore. God of glory, glory, we want to see your glory shining brighter, brighter. We long to see your name be lifted higher, higher. We will sing your praise forevermore, forevermore. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him who sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him who sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him who sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him who sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him. Sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him who sits on the throne. All blessing and honor, wisdom and power to him.
Lord, you're so welcome here. Holy Spirit, come. Come and invade this place now. Lord, we love you, and we want to give you our highest praise. thank you for your presence and thank you for what you've already been doing on this camp. God of our mothers and fathers, come now and move among us. What you did before, come and do once more. We want to be a part of your story. God of our mothers and fathers, show your glory to your sons and daughters. What you did back then, come and be again. We want to see your power in our presence, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place. Come and move, God, move, God, in this place. God of our mothers and fathers, send your spirit just like you promised. You can have your way. Visit us today. We want to see your power in our presence, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place. Come and move, God. in our day. Come and move in this place, in our time, in our day. Come and move in this place. Come and move, God. Move, God. Move, God, in this place. We're going to sing a new song. It's about the hunger for getting to know Jesus even more. We want to see his face. We really want to know what it's like to see him eye to eye and be with him. And it was inspired. I have a 4-year-old and he's frustrated every night because we pray to Jesus before he goes to bed. He's like, I want to see him. He calls him out and he's like, what is his hair like? What is his eyes like? What clothes is he wearing? And I think we need that desperate longing for seeing Jesus, for getting to know him even more, for him to invade our lives, for him to visit us every day. So. Jesus, I want to know you more. Come walk beside me, Lord. Lead me on. Find me desperately reaching out, restless and calling out for my friend. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. Teach me the melody in your voice. When you sing over me, I am yours. Show me the colors of grace and truth, and how you make all things new as we walk. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. as gentle rain, mercy rain, as gentle rain, mercy rain. I will give you all my love. I will give you all my praise. All my hope is placed in you, my Lord. Like a child, I come to you. Arms stretched out, I run to you. You are all I long for and adore. Let's sing this again. We will give you all praise. I will give you all my love. I will give you all my praise. All my hope is placed in you, my Lord. Like a child, I come to you. Arms stretched out, I run to you. You are all I long for and adore, my Lord. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. Jesus, Jesus, let me see your face. Let your mercy fall as gentle rain. Held close in the fragrance of your embrace, I see my Savior's face. I am whole.
Good morning, summer camp. How are you feeling today? Are you all awake? Gotten to
spend some time in good worship this morning, and it's good, right? They've done a really, really good job. And you can just feel God's presence this morning. So good. My name is Carolina Lund, and I'm from Oslo. I'll help you through this meeting today. So first, we have some translation during the meeting. So for de som trenger oversetning til norsk, svensk eller dansk, så finner dere hodetelefoner bakerst under broen, så gjerne gå og hente. For those who need translation into a Scandinavian language, might not be a point in saying that in English, but yeah, you can find headphones in the back. Helle Samuelsen from Rønne Vineyard, you'll help us introduce some of the storytellers this morning.
Good morning. Actually, not really stories, but I'm introducing something else. I am from Rønne Vineyard, part of that church plant, and I'm enjoying that very well and very much. And as a church planter, you also need a job, and I had the huge privilege of getting involved with a mission organization called OM, Operation Mobilization. Do you know that? Some of you do. It's really an amazing mission organization working in 110 countries around the world and through a ship called Logos Hope. And the vision of this mission organization is that everyone in the whole world, everybody should hear the gospel at least once. That must be a human right, I think. And the truth is that the number of people who never hear the gospel ever in their lifetime is increasing rapidly. I have a slide, I hope. Did you get that? No? Next one. Click, 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 click. As you see, it's very sad numbers. So there's lots to do. So I'm just here to invite you to help OM doing something with these numbers. If you want an adventure with God for some months, for some years, then get involved and reach the least reached people in this world. And for those of you who are pastors, I can just say that I'm very encouraged by OM, because when people come back, they are more involved with, they are more in love with Jesus, and they are really in love also with the local church, becoming pillars in their local church when they come home. And I think that's a very big strength. So if you want to hear more about the possibilities, or you have a son or a daughter or a cousin or a neighbor who are considering going out on missions, then please visit this table down here and hear more about all the really amazing and exciting possibilities of going on mission. And this is my colleague from Sweden, Elisabeth.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you this week. And we are so thrilled about what God has for us this week, right? And as Helle said, everyone should hear the gospel at least once. And as OM, we are a global community of Jesus followers, united to bring God's love who don't know it yet. And we would love to hang out with you, pray for you, and come and visit our stand. And the thing is this: we will press forward until every creature has heard the gospel. And we will show you a video now, and enjoy it. Let God speak to you, and as the Spirit lead you, you can be involved by praying, giving, and going. This is our story.
We are a global community of Jesus followers.
Since our beginnings, we have been driven by the deep conviction
that everyone should hear the gospel at least once.
So we went.
No place was too hard.
No people too far.
No idea too crazy.
No dream too big.
And our failures did not hold us back.
Tens of thousands have joined us.
And hundreds of millions have heard the gospel.
But we're not done yet.
We believe the gospel has the power
To change everyone and everything.
including the reality of those who are oppressed,
Forgotten and marginalized.
We believe it is God's mission
To transform lives and communities.
as He reconciles the world to Himself. We have the privilege of joining with Him in this mission.
This transformation isn't reserved for those we serve.
It happens to us too.
It happens to us too.
When we step out in faith, we start to change as well.
Our hearts are changed.
And so are our attitudes, relationships, and priorities.
Our soul is refreshed and we find significance
And who He has made us to be.
And what He has made us to do.
We are a group of people who don't fit a mold.
Who don't sit still.
And who love the adventure of serving Jesus.
We're looking for many more to join us on this journey.
We listen first and don't just show up in a new place.
And project our way of doing and thinking.
We wake up each day
With the confidence that the God who created the universe,
Who knocked over the walls of Jericho
who healed the blind,
and raise the dead.
is with us.
This emboldens us.
Empowers us.
And keeps us moving forward.
We believe everyone was made for God's purposes.
Our talents.
Our gifts and our passions.
Are His tools in us.
If God wired us to design, then we design.
If He wired us to organize, we organize.
If He wired us to build, then we build.
We want our work and our words
To shine His light.
So that those we live amongst will see it.
And glorify God.
Thousands of peoples and communities.
With their own culture and language.
Have never heard about Jesus.
Ever. Our passion is that they would hear of His fame and renown.
We believe.
We believe.
We believe.
We believe.
We believe.
We believe that a vibrant community
Reproduces itself.
Life produces life.
Constantly.
We are a global community
Of Jesus' followers.
Great. So many great people before me has introduced this man during this week, so I'm going to keep it short. But I did put on one of my favorite t-shirts in honor of this man today. So this band is one of my absolute favorite bands. I'm a huge fan, but I do think this guy might be a tad bigger fan than me. So let's welcome John Mumford up to the stage and hear what he has to share with us today.
Good morning. What can I say, Carolina? You want me to sing? No, you do not want me to sing. I promise you, you do not want me to sing. Oh, sweetheart, you are kind. I know. How's that? Is that better? Very good. Thank you so much. Every year, for many years, we've done a conference in the UK, most recent, last number of years in Nottingham, the Trent Vineyard. And we were worshipping shortly after Marcus embarked upon this activity. He was... Korea, thank you, that's the word I'm looking for. We were worshipping together at the conference, and at one point, I didn't realize it, but a man called Sean Byrne was standing next to me. Sean and Debbie, if you know them, lead the Vineyard in Dublin, in Ireland. And he has a wicked sense of humor, among other things. And he wrote to me a week later after the conference. He said, John, thank you so much. It was a wonderful conference, and the Lord blessed us, and it was a great success. Love from Sean and Debbie. P.S. I stood next to John during worship. Full stop. Marcus gets his singing voice from Eleanor. So that's the reason you don't want me to sing. Now look, if you have a Bible, would you like to turn to Paul's first letter to Timothy? We're coming into 1 Timothy, we're coming into land on this mini-series that you have endured these last 3 days, that Ellen and I have done. And I want to pick up from where I left off by turning you to 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 11, where Paul, writing to Timothy, has this little phrase. He talks about the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which he, God, entrusted to me, Paul. I love this phrase, the glorious gospel of the blessed God. And if you were here on Monday morning, you will have heard me talk about the good news. And we extracted it from Paul's sermon in Athens, in Acts, recorded in Acts chapter 17. When we were talking about marriage and so on yesterday, and I think at the Q&A, if you were here at the Q&A, they asked Dave and Colleen and Eleanor and me how we met. And when we got decided eventually, we were secretly engaged for how many years? Nearly 4 years. For a variety of reasons. It took me a long time to persuade her that this would be a very good thing to do, to marry me. And eventually, when we did get engaged 40-something years ago, we went to a jeweler's shop in Salisbury, which is a country town in Wiltshire. And I distinctly remember that this was in order to buy an engagement ring, of course. And I distinctly remember that the jeweler had in those days had a large glass cabinet with a glass top, and you could peer at all the impossibly expensive rings. And I remember what he actually did was he went to the back and he got a black piece of velvet. And he laid it out on the top of the glass cabinet. And then, one by one, he produced from inside the cabinet a number of different rings with which in order to display his magnificent selection. And of course, you can imagine the contrast with the dark background made the diamonds glitter all the more spectacularly. And there is a sense in which when Paul uses the phrase that was up there a moment ago, the glorious gospel of Jesus, there's a sense in which Paul, when he comes to write to the Timothy, he spreads out the black background of what is going on in order that the gospel, the good news, might sparkle all the more brilliantly. And that really is the theme of this letter he writes to Timothy. In the 16th century, There was a man by the name of William Tyndale. He was the first person to translate the Bible from its original languages, Greek and Hebrew, into English. This was only 70 or 80 years after the invention of the printing press, so he moved pretty rapidly to take advantage of this new technology. And he got into a lot of trouble and it was finally executed because having the Bible in a language that the people would understand was seen as hugely threatening politically. Isn't that interesting? They preferred to keep it in Latin because it would have less impact on the nation. And he was eventually executed on account of spreading dissension because he translated the Bible into English. Isn't that extraordinary? Anyhow, he said this of the gospel, of this word. Evangelion is the word in the original language, the Greek language. It is a Greek word, and it signifies good, merry, glad, and joyful tidings. Good, merry, glad, and joyful tidings that maketh a man's heart glad and maketh him sing, dance, and leap for joy. So we probably ought to show that video clip of Dave dancing at the South African Vineyard Leaders Conference. I mean, that'll go down as a classic, won't it? In the archives of the global vineyard. But don't you love it? Here he's saying this word, evangelion, the gospel, the good news, maketh a man's heart glad and maketh him sing, dance, and leap for joy. It's the word evangelion is the word that we get in the English language, evangelical, which is, broadly speaking, how in the vineyard we define ourselves. By which I mean, now, the term evangelical, or in some circles they talk about conservative evangelicals as distinct from liberal ones. But some people these days are a little uncomfortable with the term evangelical, partly, I think, because in certain parts of the world, that term has become linked with distinctly right-wing politics, particularly in the United States. But the term itself, in its original form, I think is a very helpful and accurate description of who we are. Even if we have to use shorthand, and we do sometimes have to use shorthand, we can't go far wrong by describing ourselves as evangelicals. John Wimber often used to say, I'm a conservative evangelical, he said. And he said, I'm an evangelical who believes in and tries to function in the gifts, all the gifts of the Holy Spirit, as distinct from a conservative evangelical who doesn't. Which was a helpful distinction. So let's look at a little bit more at what Timothy is saying to us about the gospel, and particularly about what a wonderful church should look like. Chapter 1, let's read it. Chapter 1, and we'll start at verse 3. This is Paul writing to Timothy. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus, so that you may command certain persons not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. In other words, stuff. Do you remember we talked about the main and the plain? Well, they were concentrating on whatever the opposite is of the main and the plain, the trivial and the unimportant. That's what they were doing with these myths and endless genealogies. Such things, he writes, promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. The goal of this command, he says, is love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they don't know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is not made for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and the irreligious, those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for those who are sexually immoral, for those who are practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers. That's the black background I was talking about. And he says, standing against that background, and he says, whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he has entrusted to me. And one of the themes that emerges very strongly in Paul's first letter is that there were false teachers. You notice in verse 7 he talks about teachers of the law who are in fact, in verse 3, teaching false doctrines. So he's setting the scene. So what Timothy is saying, Timothy was left in Ephesus to stem this tide. This was going on. This false teaching was beginning to gain some traction in the church in Ephesus. And so Paul left Timothy there in order to sort it out. And there's an urgency to it. I urge you to do this. I command you to do this. You see in verse 3, you may command certain persons not to teach false doctrines any longer. You may know that this first letter to Timothy, for many years, many scholars assumed that it was a handbook for church order. In other words, how you govern churches and oversee them. But people thought that what Paul was doing to Timothy was giving him a handbook on how to organize the church. The funny thing is that down through church history, the entire spectrum of the body of Christ have gone to 1 Timothy in order to justify their own particular theory of government. So you have on the one hand what you might call the hierarchical episcopal leadership of the Catholic Church, on the one hand. Then somewhere in the middle you have the sort of quasi-democratic Presbyterians, a few centuries later. And then a little more recently than that, in the previous century, you had what you might call the extreme congregationalism of the Plymouth Brethren, or the Christian Brethren, if you heard them. So, I mean, literally, in terms of how you lead churches and govern churches, polar opposites. And in some cases, they went to war with each other. And the funny thing is, they all use precisely the same texts in this book. So, as Gordon Fee comments, he says, they seem to use these texts a bit like a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And Gordon Fee goes on, if Paul intended the purpose of this letter to be that of definitively setting the church in good order, we can only say that he failed miserably. So out goes that theory. What it seems to be that Paul is dealing with here is people who've crept into the church with what he calls here false teaching, and he, as I say, he unpacked it, false doctrines. And that's what he seems to be talking about. Now, it's funny, isn't it? In the Vineyard, it's not unusual to find people who are somewhat dismissive of the whole idea of doctrine. Have you come across that? It's like the word has a sense of sort of sterile intellectualism. Oh, it's academic, they say, or it's boring, or it's divisive, they complain. So if you want to read a Christian book, don't read a book on doctrine. No, don't do that. Read something far more exciting. And if you want to find a good church, make sure you choose one where the worship lasts way longer than the sermon. But all one can say is that that wasn't how Paul saw it. And if Timothy was going to set the rest of his congregation a good example, says Paul, you mustn't see it like that either. So there are a number of different themes that emerge from Paul's first letter to Timothy, and of course I haven't got time to deal with anything like all of them, but one that does stand out very strongly, and I want to draw your attention to, is what he calls in different places sound doctrine. Sound doctrine. And his point is that doctrine matters. And it matters because of this, that what we believe ultimately determines how we behave. Or you could put it like this, our creed is the seedbed of our conduct. You see, the false teachers that were troubling the church with Ephesus, that he refers to in these opening verses, specifically, it seems that their error was lying in the area of Christian ethics. If you turn over to chapter 4, let me just, because you might ask, well, what was the particular error? Well, the particular error, it seems that they were talking about, were these, what do they call them? These, chapter 4, holding out promise, having nothing to do with godless myths, again he uses that word, and old wives' tales. Rather, he says, train yourselves to be godly. What if you just look a few verses, he says, such teachings, and he's talking about the false teaching, such teaching come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared with a hot iron. They forbid people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods, which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and who know the truth. For everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. So what they were saying, some of these false teachers, was there's certain food you can't touch. And my guess is, what would you think these days? What would they pick on? They'd pick on chocolate, wouldn't they? Yeah, and I'm sure they'd pick on decent wine. And, I mean, basically anything that you and I enjoy, they'd slap a label on, wouldn't it, saying that's prohibited. And they were also forbidding people to marry. They forbade people to marry. And in both instances, they were dictating behavior. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't eat that, you shouldn't marry, and, everything else that goes with marriage. But of course we can't talk about it, can we, because we're Christians. But if we were to talk about it, I'm talking about sex. Do you see? So they were talking about behavior, but if you look closely, the real issue is the doctrine underneath it, the truth under it. Because, you see, they were saying these things are bad. Don't touch them. Whereas Paul counters here by saying, hang on, no. These things, God twice, he says, God created them. So by definition, they can't be bad. Look in this is chapter 4, verse 3, God created to be received with thanksgiving. So God created these things. God created delicious food. God created marriage and all that goes with it. Do you see? And therefore, it's something to be enjoyed. The funny thing is, isn't it? These strange false teachers were saying, well, marry if you must, but don't have sex. Do you see? And elsewhere in the Bible, the teaching of Paul is it turns out exactly on its head, 180 degrees. Because the Bible teaches that if you're married, then don't stop having sex. The false teachers will say, stop it. Paul was saying, keep at it. Yes, stop if you must. Stop to fast and to pray. But then he specifically says, get back to it quickly once you finish fasting and praying. Well, he was a sensible gentleman. He was a realist, wasn't he? But my point is, you see, that the mistake here was a theological one, not an ethical one. Do you see that? They were saying something was bad, and Paul said, no, these things are good. So don't abstain from them. Make sense? The fundamental problem was not an ethical one, it was a theological one. And all I'm trying to do here, you say, well, John, where on earth are you going with this? Very good question. Where I'm going with this is with the direction of a healthy, wonderful church, and the direction we're heading, and the direction this movement is heading, and the direction Vineyard globally is heading over the next 20, 40, 50, 100 years. One of the things we have got to keep an eye on, and must not disdain, is what Paul would call sound doctrine. So I urge you, we were praying the night before last, I think it was, for some of the people who are teachers of the scriptures. And that would include, and it did include, some people who are giving their lives to what we would call academic theology. And we need that. We need people to help us to understand the truth and to apply it as culture shifts and changes and does what culture does. We need people who can help us take the eternal truths and apply them to these different situations in order that we may maintain sound doctrine and not go off the rails. Do you know that in the fight in the United States Treasury, it runs an organization called the FBI. And in their fight against counterfeit currency, young trainees from the FBI were sent to work at the Treasury, and to their surprise, when they got there, very little attention was given to fake currency dollar bills. No? They spent most of their time studying genuine dollar bills in the greatest of detail. The paper, the ink, the watermarks, and so on and so forth. And as I say, very little time at all examining forgeries. And when they asked their instructor why this was, the instructor replied, "The more you know the real thing, the more quickly you'll recognize the fake." And so in our ongoing study of the scriptures, that'll help us enormously as we understand and grasp the gospel and sound doctrine. So, one theme is sound doctrine that emerges. A second theme is what I'd call godly character. And I want you to look to the chapter 3. Godly character, chapter 3. Let me read it to you. Here is a trustworthy saying. It's funny, isn't it, when Paul puts that in? Here's a trustworthy saying. Well, what does that imply about all the rest? A little dodgy? No, I don't think so. I think he's just saying this is particularly worth you paying attention to. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now, basically, he's talking about leadership here. And the precise meaning of the word overseer, again, has been debated, but for this morning's purposes, let's talk about leadership. When you say, hang on, John, this is not a leadership conference, it's a summer camp. Yes, I know that. Yeah, I'm fully aware of that. But my point is that it does talk about whoever aspires to be. So there are some of you here who would never describe yourselves as leaders. But more than once you've thought to yourself, or maybe you felt the Lord say to you, do you know, I wonder if God's calling me to that. So let me address it. Personally, I don't think we ought to confine teaching on the subject of leadership just to gatherings of leaders. Personally, I think that's a mistake. I think it's healthy and good for the whole of the body of Christ to hear about teaching on leadership, because it helps, it gives a context, it gives an understanding. It underlines the importance of this gift that God has given to the church that we call leadership or oversight or whatever you want to call it. So maybe you're sitting here and, I don't know, you regularly, do you have Starbucks in this part of the world? Was that a deep insult to the Scandinavian people? You do have Starbucks. You're a student, and you spend rather a lot of time in Starbucks, actually. And you have a couple of friends who are very interested in talking about Christianity. And so you gather together and you meet at Starbucks once a week and you consume a large quantity of coffee and you spend most of your time answering their questions. Don't look now, but that's leadership. Well, you say, I'm not a leader. Well, it depends what you mean. You are, in that you're influencing a couple of people. You see, leadership comes in all shapes and sizes. And for those who are aspiring to leadership, this is a classic text that Paul has given us. It's incredibly helpful. Verse 2. Now the overseer is to be above reproach. These are, in a sense, a list of criteria. The sorts of things Paul says we're looking for in those who are leadership. So we're looking for this in people who are already leaders. We're also holding this out as a model, as an example, as a standard, as a set of expectations for any of you here that aspire to be leaders and will be leaders in the future. Now, the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife if he's married, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. Because if anyone doesn't know how to manage his own family, how on earth can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. So here he's saying, he begins, verse 2, the overseer is to be above reproach. That's verse 2. And then if you just shoot down to verse 7, he must also have a good reputation with outsiders. Think of those two statements, one in verse 2 and the other in verse 7. Think of them like bookends on a bookshelf. Because in a sense, when Paul says, an overseer is to be above reproach, in a sense that's his summary, and the various specific instructions that he writes in the rest of verse 2, 3, 4, and 5, are basically unpacking what it means to be above reproach. And then he sums it up at the end by saying all these things should contribute to the fact that this person must have a good reputation with outsiders. A true overseer, it must be the type of person whose personal behavior will counter that of the false teachers, do you see, that he's been talking about in the text, and help the church maintain its credibility. And what is so damaging is when leaders crash, is that it's not only a tragedy for them and their families often, but also it damages the credibility of the church and the rest of the body of Christ. So above reproach, what's he getting at? That basically nobody has anything legitimate against you. St. John Chrysostom wrote, every virtue is implied in this word, above reproach. Husband of one wife. By that I think he's getting at, if a leader or an overseer is married, that they should be steady and stable as well as monogamous. And if difficulties arise in marriage, as they do, as we all experience, those of us married, to dig in and to fight to save it and to preserve it. So healthy, strong marriages, I think, is the underlying theme of what he said. Temperate, not given to extremes. Self-control, by that I think he means reflective, not impulsive. We sometimes describe wisdom, don't we, which is knowledge that's been applied. Wimber had written in the front, do you call it the flyleaf of his Bible? And I saw it once. He had the word restraint written to remind him, but not once, but 3 times. Restraint, restraint, restraint. And he had discovered that the more he went on, the older he got as a leader, the more he needed to be self-controlled and to be restrained. Respectable. I don't think there Paul is talking about middle-class uptightness. I think by respectable, I think we could use the word integrity. I think that's the true meaning of the word. A person who can be trusted and walks in honesty. Integrity means they're integrated. In other words, what they say and what they do interlock, as opposed to there being a bit discrepancy between the two. Hospitable, somebody who loves people. They're open to showing love and affection for all people. Very important. The ability to teach An overseer must be a good teacher and learner. You will have noticed already that all these attributes that are listed are about character. This is the one exception. It's talking about gifting. People who are able to look for people. Let me speak to those of you who are pastors. Look for people in your church, in your congregation, who are good at explaining things. People who are good at, particularly for young people or to younger Christians, are able to take this book and to unpack it and to make it palatable and understandable to people. Carrying on to verse 3, much wine, not given to much wine. Again, the point he's making here is that joy comes from Jesus, not from substances. That's really the point he's making. Not violent. Again, not ruled by emotions. You know, watch how, those of you who are younger, watch how older men or women handle volatile situations. It can be very instructive. Over the years, I've learned a lot just by watching how these things are handled. Gentle. To me, gentleness speaks of security, an internal security. They've no need to prove anything. They've no need to persuade you that they are a leader and they're going to lead you. When people start doing that and, you know, do what I tell you because I'm your leader, all your alarm bells ought to ring. No. These are the sorts of things we must work on. These are the sorts of things we must hold one another to account on. These are very, very important in the whole business of leading a church that is going to be full of stability and health. What is the assumption here? What assumption is Paul making when he gives this list of criteria for leaders? I think the underlying assumption is that somebody is going to scrutinize. So Paul gives us a list. Here are the standards. Here are the expectations of leaders. Well, now, how is that going to be matched and married to the characters of individual leaders, myself included? Answer, somebody has to scrutinize me. I imagine as you're sitting there and listening to Ellen and me, and indeed others up here speaking, people who are leaders of one sort or another, your assumption is, isn't it, that somebody has scrutinized me. You may not have done it. That doesn't matter, but somebody has. I mean, the last thing you'd want is anybody leading you who was completely, as it were, unexamined and unscrutinized, isn't it? I mean, you'd never join a church, would you? If you thought this leader was, none of the Pauline biblical criteria are being applied to. Is there a checklist? Do you see my point? And sometimes, my observation is sometimes with leaders, when they do get into trouble with any one of these issues, and we address it, their response is to turn around and say, how dare you? This is private. This is between me and the Lord. How dare you address this? Who do you think you are? To which our reply is, somebody's got to. Somebody's got to do this job. And you want people, this is my point, you want people to scrutinize you. You really do. It's very, very helpful. To have your loving critics. Every now and then in leadership, I'm sure you do the same. I'm sure you do it in business quite as much in the church. We'll do a 360 assessment. And you've got various people, different people, who are with different relationships to a leader, will give their own feedback about the leader. Very helpful. Sometimes it hurts a little bit, but that's no bad thing. But healthy churches have a culture, an expectation and understanding that we'll hold one another to account and we're conformed to these things. And believe me, it's when these things go wrong that's usually because people haven't been scrutinized properly and carefully enough, and that leads to damage. So, sound doctrine and godly character. These are fundamental. So no wonder that Paul says, train yourself to be godly. And he goes on to say in chapter 4, verse 12, set an example. A big part of what leadership is about is set an example, even for the list of things we've just talked about, is to have somebody who is actually not just talking about it, but actually doing it, or actually demonstrating these very things in their lives, is enormously helpful. And as Paul says, set an example for the believers in godliness. This is chapter 4 and verse 12. In godliness, in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. Set an example. Set an example. If leadership is about anything, it's about that. And the people said, Amen. I believe it's time for coffee. Oh.
Thank you. I'll say the same thing you just said. Who's ready for coffee? That would be good, right? So we'll have a 30-minute break, and then the seminars will start at 11. So please do check out the different seminars in the hallway, and go grab some coffee and be back 10 minutes to 11 to respect the speakers. Perfect.